Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org. The following material is copyrighted and may not be duplicated, reproduced, or redistributed without prior written consent from the Veritas Forum. Join us as we explore true life.
Well, I appreciated very much Dr. Hardin sharing on a personal level about his experience, and I think that it underlines the importance for us who are Christians not to squelch the honest questions of our own children when they ask them. I know in our own life, I really encouraged my kids to ask the hard questions about the existence of God and what Christians believe, because I meet so many people as I travel speaking on different university campuses who have come from Christian backgrounds and who have lost their faith precisely because their questions as children were squelched and they were told, well, just believe, you just got to have faith. And I think it's so tragic because these questions are so easily answered. They are not difficult, I think, to answer, and I'll specifically address that question about who made God in a moment. But first, let's ask ourselves, have we still seen any good reasons to think scientific naturalism is true? Now, Dr. Hardin didn't disagree with the definition I gave of naturalism, that is to say that the natural world is all there is, and that we should only believe what can be scientifically proven. But I gave reasons as to why I thought both of those claims are untenable. Since science is by nature limited to the natural world, how could it possibly prove there's nothing beyond the natural world? I'm still waiting for an answer to that question. And secondly, I argued that it's far too restrictive to say that we should only believe what can be scientifically proven. There are vast realms of truth in ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, science itself that can't be scientifically proven, but that we all accept and are rational in doing so. And then I argued, in fact, it's self-refuting to say you should only believe what can be scientifically proven. So I still think we've not seen any good reasons to think scientific naturalism is the truth, nor have we seen any refutation of those objections. Now, with respect to the signposts of transcendence that I offered, Dr. Hardin made some general comments, for example, saying that we should have nothing in words, the motto of the Royal Society. But of course, many of the members of the Royal Society, most when it was founded, who adopted that motto were themselves Christians. And they did not mean thereby to repudiate religion or Christianity. And in fact, in my first speech, that's why I specifically appealed to empirical evidence, not mere words. We looked at things like the origin of the universe in the Big Bang as a signpost of transcendence, the complex order that astrophysicists have discovered in the Big Bang, the existence of objective moral values in the world that we all experience, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and then our experience of God himself. In other words, I've appealed to a broad range of human experience, scientific, ethical, historical, personal, and all of these, I think, point beyond the natural world to something greater as its ground. Now, Dr. Hardin suggested that the word God has no meaning. Well, as an analytic philosopher, definition of terms is very important to me, and I think I would define the word God in the following way: a personal being who is omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, immaterial, and wholly good. And that's going to be my working definition of what I mean by God. So that's the definition I'm operating with. That's a Christian understanding of God. And if he thinks that that's incoherent, then I simply await the demonstration to hear why that is. Now, let's look then at those signposts of transcendence. First, I said the origin of the universe points beyond itself to something greater. And Dr. Hardin agreed that to say something came from nothing is just unacceptable. So there has to be a cause of the origin of the universe. But then he asks, well, who made God? Well, very simply, as I argued in my opening speech, as a cause of space and time itself, The cause of the universe must be an uncaused, immaterial, spaceless, and timeless being. In other words, nobody made God. God didn't come from anywhere. God is what philosophers call an absolutely necessary being. That is, a being which is eternal, uncaused, incorruptible, and indestructible. And I would argue that the origin of the universe points to its creation by such an entity. And there certainly is good empirical evidence for this origin. J.M. Wersinger, professor of physics at Auburn University, writing in the National Forum of 1996, says the following: "At first, the scientific community was very reluctant to accept the idea of a birth of the universe. Not only did the Big Bang model seem to give in to the Judeo-Christian idea of a beginning of the world, but it also seemed to call for an act of supernatural creation. It took time, observational evidence, and careful verification of predictions made by the Big Bang model to convince the scientific community to accept the idea of a cosmic genesis. The Big Bang is a very successful model that imposed itself upon a reluctant scientific community." So I think we have good grounds for saying the universe has this absolute origin in which space, time, matter, and energy come to exist out of nothing, and that points beyond itself to its origin in a creator. Secondly, I argue that the complex order of the universe points to the intelligence of this creator because these initial conditions cannot be explained by scientific law because they are initial conditions just put in at the beginning, and the odds against them are so incalculable as to be incomprehensible, and thus the hypothesis of design seems eminently reasonable. Thirdly, remember I said the existence of objective moral values points to God. And again, it's hard to see on a naturalistic view how there could be objective moral values. J.P. Moreland, a philosopher, writes as following: "On an evolutionary secular scenario, human beings are nothing special. The universe came from a Big Bang. It evolved to us through a blind process of chance and necessity. There's nothing intrinsically valuable about human beings in terms of having moral, non-natural properties. The view that being human is special is guilty of speciesism, an unjustifiable bias toward one's own species." So on a naturalistic view, there's no reason to think human beings and their values are any more objective or important than guinea pigs or even mosquitoes. This is especially evident through two implications of a naturalistic worldview. First would be materialism. On a naturalistic view, you are just a collection of chemicals in a bag of skin. If a bomb blast destroys a child in Bosnia, all that's happened is that nature has rearranged the collocation of atoms that used to be a little girl. The other implication is determinism. If naturalism is true, then everything that we think and do is determined by our genetic makeup and the input of our five senses. There is no freedom of the will. Our actions have no more moral significance than having a toothache or a tree growing a branch. So it's very difficult to see how there could be objective moral values on naturalism. And yet I think it's evident that moral values do exist, that certain things like love are really good, and that there's an objective difference between loving and nurturing a child and torturing and abusing that child. That points beyond the world to God. Signpost number 4 was the resurrection of Jesus. I shared 3 established facts recognized by historians. I don't know how the naturalist can explain these, frankly. And finally, one's immediate experience of God. I've come to have an experience of God in my own life. He's real to me. I experience God as a living reality. In the absence of any good arguments for atheism, why should I deny my experience and think that I'm having a delusion? In the absence of arguments for atheism, it seems to me that I'm quite within my rights to believe that, in fact, my experience of God is veridical. So on the basis of all of these signposts of transcendence, it seems to me quite reasonable to believe that the natural world is not all there is, that there's more, that there is a creator, a designer, a God who has revealed himself in Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Professor Craig. And now back to you, Professor Hardin.
Well, I may surprise you, but I'm going to say a few words in favor of faith. But you'll see a very special circumstance. Lucretius, again, we're back to the 1st century before Christ. Lucretius wrote a poem on the nature of things in which, with great logical ability, he deduced the existence really of the molecular world, that these solid things weren't really solid. They were made up of little individual particles that could move separately. He called them atoms. The word has changed over the centuries. What he called atoms, we call molecules now. And that was as far as this idea of molecular theory of matter got, as far as Lucretius carried it then, until the 19th century, when the theory of molecules and molecular theory of matter was developed to a great extent. And the important thing is, how did it get developed? What do I mean developed? Well, see, what people would be saying would be, say, like, show me God, show me a molecule. You couldn't show him a molecule. How can you believe in molecules when nobody's ever seen one? Difficult point. In 1821, a botanist named Robert Brown reported that if you look through a microscope at a plant cell, at the cytoplasm that moves around, look, if you have enough magnification, you see that individual particles in the cytoplasm are constantly vibrating, constantly. They never give up, never. It's as though there were no friction. This is ridiculous. There's friction every place you look in the world, but there's no friction there. And this sort of shook people up, but mostly just biologists, because there was a lot of separation of the sciences. And it wasn't until the last of the century that people began to see what the significance of this, and the significance is that these things that you see are being bombarded by molecules. And in fact, one of the three great papers that Einstein wrote in 1905 was on the Brownian motion. This was an absolutely important thing. And shortly after that, a few decades, we began to see things that we could say were, one thing I can't see is, what does that number say on there? See, there's light here. You have to work out something else.
5 minutes.
5, not 50. Okay, all right. I'll make it brief. All right. So that was a shaking thing. That really convinced many physicists who hadn't been convinced before when they saw molecular motion. Said, that really looks convincing. And in this century, finally, we saw things that we could prove were molecules moving. And before then, we had taken it on faith. Now, there's an example of something that's taken on faith. But the point was, it wasn't just taken a broadside on faith. The physicists worked out the conclusions, what must be true of these molecules if they are moving the way you say. And they had that all worked out well in advance of actually seeing it. So this, verifying it was sort of an anticlimax. Well, that's the only sense in which faith is used in science. New things that come along often have a great many rough edges, and we do take them on faith for a while. But the idea is someday they've got to prove themselves. They've got to get out of this shadow of faith. Otherwise, we won't take them.
Thank you, Professor Hardin. Back to you, Dr. Craig.
Okay, and this is my closing
Yes.
remarks. You remember my fifth signpost of transcendence was the experience of God. And since Dr. Hardin shared a little of his personal life, I'd like to conclude by sharing a little bit of mine. Unlike Professor Hardin, I wasn't raised in a Christian home or even a church-going family. My folks were just good Midwestern folks, but not particularly religious. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask the big questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? What is the meaning of my life and my death? And in the search for answers, I began to attend a large church in our local community just on my own. But what I discovered instead of Answers was a social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate. And the other high school students who claimed to be such good Christians on Sunday lived for their real God the rest of the week, which was popularity. And this really bothered me because I was living externally a really moral life, and yet I felt so empty inside. And I looked at these other students and I thought, here they claim to be Christians, and I'm living a better life than they are. They must be even emptier than I am, but they're just a bunch of phonies. They're a bunch of hypocrites putting up a false face to the world, while the real person is hiding down inside, afraid to come out and be real. And I grew very resentful toward them for that. And this attitude began to spread toward other people. I thought everybody's a phony. They're all fakes. And I was on my way to becoming a very alienated young man. I withdrew into my studies and into myself and pretended not to need other people or to want them. And yet at the same time, in moments of honesty, I knew that I too wanted to love and to be loved, and that in pretending not to need them, I was just as much a phony and a hypocrite as they were. And so this anger and hatred turned in on myself as well for my own phoniness. And I don't know if you know what this is like, but it just eats away at your insides day after day. And one day I was feeling particularly miserable, and I walked into my high school German class and sat down behind a girl who's one of these types, that is always so happy it just makes you sick. And I tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around, and I said, "Sandy, what are you always so happy about for anyway?" And she said, "Well, Bill, it's because I know Jesus Christ is my personal Savior." And I said, "You what?" And she said, I said, "I go to church." And she said, "Well, Bill, that's not enough. You've got to have him really living in your heart." And I said, "Well, what would he want to do a thing like that for?" And she said, "Because he loves you, Bill." And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was so filled with anger and hate, and she said there was someone who really loved me. And who was it but the God of the universe? And that thought just staggered me. And so during the next 6 months, I went on the most intense soul-searching period of my life I've ever been through. I read the New Testament from cover to cover. I read books. She introduced me to other Christians in the high school. I'd never met people like this. It was like they were in touch with a different plane of reality that I didn't even know existed and that I wanted for my life. Well, after this period of 6 months, to make a long story short, I just came to the end of myself, and I just cried out to God one night and just cried out all the anger and the bitterness that was in me. And at the same time, I felt this tremendous infusion of joy just filling me like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. And I remember I rushed outside. It was a warm September evening, and I could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. And I looked up at the stars, and I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment changed my life. I had thought enough about this message during those 6 months to realize that if I ever became a Christian myself, I could do nothing less than spend my entire life telling others about this truth. And that's basically why I'm here tonight in this debate, because God got a hold of my life as a teenager, and for the last 30 years, he hasn't let go. As I've walked with him day by day, year by year, he's continued to be an immediate reality to me. And I just want to encourage you, if you haven't found God in that way, to begin to do what I did. Pick up a New Testament, start to read the Gospels, and ask yourself, could this really be the truth? Could there really be a God who created the universe, who loves me, and who has revealed himself in Christ? I believe that it could change your life in the same way that it changed mine. Thank you.
Turn now to Professor Hardin.
Well, I think I'll complain of unfair labor practices first. How can you put me after that eloquent statement? But curiously, I'm going to tell a story that in a sense is the same story, but it has the opposite conclusion. I think this may be important. Another story, again, I haven't told it before. This is 14 years old, high school. I had a friend, walked home halfway every day. We lived about a mile and a half from the high school, and at a mile we had to divide. Went to the left, I went to the right. But of course, before we divided, we stood around, and, you know, the way teenagers will do, and talked and talked and talked. We had to solve all the world's problems before we separated. And we got most of them solved. And the occasion that I remember, I was on to religions for some reason or other. I got interested in comparative religions, and I was interested in Zoroastrianism. And if you ask why, it was because of that lovely sound of the word beginning with Z. And when I discovered that it could be called Zarathustra instead of Zoroaster, I thought, oh, how ugly, Zarathustra, really. So I studied Zoroaster. Now, we separated. We'd been talking about religion, and then I was walking by myself down a railroad track, as a matter of fact, and all of a sudden, I said out loud, "There is no God." And the incredible feeling that I had that I'd never had before, I suddenly was walking on air. Most incredible. We couldn't have weighed more than 5 pounds. And for the next week or so, I don't know how long, I was still walking on air, gradually less and less, and finally I forgot about it. And I didn't see the significance of it until about 20 years later when I read William James' The Varieties of Religious Experience, and he has many accounts there of a person seeing God, seeing the true way to the religious life, and he goes through an experience of that sort, and I realized, well, that's exactly the same thing, because in both cases, one, the person sees God, the other person sees there is no God, but his difficulties are resolved in that moment, and from then on, he's a true believer or a true unbeliever. I became a true unbeliever.
Thank you very much, Professor Hardin. This is the Veritas Forum, and Veritas means truth. And we've heard from two very distinguished gentlemen who have spent their lives, basically, looking for truth. They've done it differently, and they've come to different conclusions, but I think we all respect and admire the honesty with which they presented their views. Now is the time where we have audience participation, and I'd like to alternate questions, one to one speaker and then to the other. And I'm not, Art or John or somebody tell me, are these mics set up for that purpose, to ask questions? Yeah, okay. So I guess I would ask anyone who wishes to ask questions or make comments to either of the speakers to come forward. There's one microphone over here near Professor Hardin, and one on the other side near Professor Craig.
It would be best to have questions for one speaker from one and then one for the others.
Yes, exactly. We'll try to alternate.
But I mean, have everybody for one of us line up behind one microphone
okay.
and
well,
everybody
let's
for the
do
other,
that.
and that way you don't get mixed up.
Okay, fine. So would people who have questions primarily for Professor Craig step toward that microphone, and those primarily with questions for Professor Hardin to that microphone. You keep coming forward. We're only going to hear one of you at a time, but you can keep on lining up. But if you wouldn't mind being quiet now, so that we can hear the first question. And the first question, Professor Hardin, please.
Correct. Dr. Hardin, I wanted to bring up the third signpost that Dr. Craig mentioned, and that is the existence of moral values. And I wanted to ask, do you believe in objective moral values? And if so, how does that square with scientific naturalism?
I suppose I would say the word objective does not apply to moral values. I don't know what one to use because I think they're rational in some sense, and I think the people who are coming at this through theory of altruism, which is a tremendous amount of literature on this now, are getting at it the right way. In other words, these are the things that work. And I wouldn't call them moral. I just say that they work, and if you want to be reasonably happy and making the best of life, follow those.
All right, first question for Professor Craig.
Yes, regarding the issue of an absolute moralism, I was raised Roman Catholic, and one of the absolute fundamental moral values I was raised with was that it is wrong inherently to terminate a human life, to kill people. And that's one of the 10 Commandments, and it made a lot of sense to me. Then, as I grew older, I learned that it was okay sometimes to kill people. For example, in times of war, self-defense, capital punishment, abortion, things like that. It was okay to terminate a human life. In view of that, I mean, to me, that seems like a very fundamental issue, and it seems to be an issue in which people pretty much, they allow their morals to wrap around whatever's convenient at the time. If we're in a war, okay, it's okay to kill people then, or in self-defense, but in general, it's not okay to kill people. To me, that defies kind of a absolute moralism, and it seems to indicate more of a human aspect than one of God. And one quick point I wanted to make as well, the idea that I'm just a bunch of atoms in a sack of fluid, to me, I find to be fantastic and incredible. And when I look up at the stars in the sky in the evening, I see such wonder that I'm a part of this universe and that I'm actually aware of that. And I can see it, that it doesn't seem meaningless to me at all. And it doesn't require
All right.
God.
It seems to me that the two sentiments you've expressed are contradictory. They move in opposite directions. On the one hand, you seem to want to affirm some absolute moral truths, and that these shouldn't be conveniently wrapped around our situations. And yet, on the other hand, you seem not to want to affirm that we're more than just a bag of chemicals on bones. Those seem to move in opposite directions, it seems to me. If you do affirm that that human life is intrinsically valuable, that people are ends and not means, then we are not simply bags of chemicals, because you can take a bag of chemicals and rip it open with a knife and spew the contents out on the ground, and that would be nothing immoral. But I think you would agree probably that if you were to go and do that to another human being, that would be immoral. That would be wrong. That would be a violation of their human worth and dignity. Now, I think that with respect to the former question, though, ethical principles clearly have to be applied to various situations. And general ethical truths have to be applied in specific cases. What I'm saying when I say there are objective values is that in any specific case, there is an objectively right thing to do and an objectively wrong thing to do. For example, I think you could say it's a general moral principle that you should not murder innocent people. And if people want to twist that around to meet human conventions, then I think they're simply wrong in doing so. And therefore, they're incorrect when they want to do that. I think it is always wrong to murder innocent people. So with respect to abortion, the whole issue there depends on whether or not you believe in the humanity of the fetus. If you believe in the humanity of the fetus, then the fetus is a human being, and to kill it is homicide. It's wrong. If you don't believe in the humanity of the fetus, if you think it's just, again, a bag of chemicals, then you don't think you're committing homicide. So that would be an example of where you would apply the ethical principle in a specific case.
Next question for Professor. I'm sorry, do you want to comment?
I hate to leave this as it is. The language, I think, is deceiving us when we speak of we should not murder an innocent person. What you have done is said the same thing twice. The Bible, the Old Testament, which is where the 10 Commandments are found, if I'm not mistaken, in Hebrew says, thou shalt not do murder. It does not say thou shalt not kill. And of course, if you read the Old Testament, the amount of killing that goes on there at the specific behest of God is amazing. It recognizes that under conditions of war, et cetera, killing may be acceptable.
Yes.
We call it murder when it isn't. And this is one of the great harms that was done in the translation of the King James Bible. It says, thou shalt not kill. That is not part of the original document at all. Thou shalt not murder, which is an utterly different thing. And as for the other part of that this is a human being, the law has always, well, until the time of Thomas Aquinas, there was great uncertainty, and Aquinas thought he settled this by saying that when the first movements are felt by the woman, that is when life, human life, enters this thing that's there, and from then on, a human being should have rights. Then, of course, later, in the 19th century, we found that there is no such thing as life ever beginning. It is merely passed on, and there's always life in some place or other, and the question is, what about the loss of the life of a being that is so small you can scarcely see it with the naked eye? What about, is that really serious? Well, at this point, I think we have to be influenced by the facts of biology. And the facts of biology, which have been well established, is that in the higher mammals, approximately 1/2 of all conceptuses are spontaneously aborted. Spontaneously aborted. That means in the United States, there are about 4 million spontaneous abortions every year, to which we have to add another million or maybe 1.5 million of deliberate abortions. But they're spontaneously aborted at so early a stage that the woman first thinks she has had a late period. I mean, first she thinks she's pregnant. Then she has a period after all. She says, oh, it was just delayed. So you see, having learned that there are 4 million spontaneous abortions, this throws an utterly new light on the thought that anything that has 46 chromosomes in it of the right sort is a human being. And we really should go back to stick with the time-honored legal principle that it's not a human being until it is born alive. Before then, it's not a human being. You deal with it some other way.
All right, I'd like to give Professor Craig a few minutes to respond to that, and then I think we need to go back to the audience questions. But
well, I think we basically agree that the issue is the fetus human? And if the fetus is human, then to kill it would be homicide. I think we agree on that general principle. So the question is, the biological question is this a human being? And I find it incredible to think that, say, a baby at 8 months gestation, which if born premature would survive, is not a human being just because it's geographically located inside the uterus instead of outside of it. So, but let me also respond to the point about the spontaneous abortions or miscarriages. I don't think that argument's very persuasive, because an analogous argument would be, look, every human being dies eventually. Therefore, there's nothing wrong with ending somebody's life, because they're all going to, they're going to die anyway. That's sort of the same sort of reasoning. Many of these fetuses die spontaneously, therefore it's nothing wrong with your killing such a being. That's like saying because human beings all are mortal and die by accidents and disease and so forth, therefore it's all right to kill them. That just seems illogical to me.
okay. I have a feeling this question may crop up again, but let's let it come from the audience if it does. Question, Professor Hardin.
My name's John Thorndike, Professor, and I'm an admirer of yours, and I certainly thank you for being here and doing this, because I'm a Christian. But my question is, and especially because of that, I believe that we only understand, you've quoted the old scripture and the new, we only understand the old through the new. So therefore, when you quote the John 1:1, that it explains God in the beginning God. And I feel that that when you say, you were profoundly affected at a very young age, at age 6 or 7, going hunting with your dad. Your grandfather had passed on, and you asked a very valid question. You didn't get an answer that you would be fighting for those answers now, So I would like to quote you, quoting John, and then add what it says in the beginning. In the beginning, God. Well, you said, in the beginning, quoting, I missed a word, and tell me if I'm right or wrong. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. I think it should be, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Is that right?
That's right. The Word
All right.
was with God, and the Word was God.
And if we take that and we add to it, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, we have the Word, because the Word says, let there be light. And the Word says, let there be so forth and so forth and so forth. So that Word spoke the earth into existence. That Word spoke the Big Bang. Thank you very much. That's all I had to say.
Any comment on that, Professor Hardin?
I that was very clever exegesis, I think. The only thing I'd say is that what that says to me is this is an honest statement of a person who thinks you create truth by using words. And see, I go along with Einstein here. I think the thoughts come first, and then later, much later, you find words that more or less fit. And this is an utterly different attitude. I don't think words can create anything except trouble.
Question of Professor Craig.
Yes. Well, I'd like to clarify some of those words so we don't create more trouble. I thought the debate was against Christianity versus naturalism, and I heard you give evidence for Christianity, Dr. Craig, and Dr. Hardin to give evidence for science. But I'm concerned about this word naturalism and the audience understanding it. And perhaps I can give an example and ask you to respond to it, if I might.
Mm-hmm.
The 1995 position statement from the National Association of Biology Teachers stated that all life on Earth was a result of evolution, defined as an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable natural process. Now the question is that statement science, or is it naturalism masquerading as science? Thank you.
Well, I think that it is clearly naturalism insofar as it says that the process was unsupervised and, what was the other word, unplanned? Impersonal.
Impersonal,
because,
unpredictable natural process.
Yeah, insofar as you say it's unsupervised and impersonal, that is implicitly making a metaphysical statement that there is no God who's beyond it. And it seems to me that science cannot make that statement, and therefore that statement is a naturalistic statement. It's an expression of a philosophy. And I appreciate the point that you're making is that it is not Christianity versus science. I mean, on the contrary, I've tried to appeal, at least in two of my signposts, to science to point in the direction of a transcendent ground. But this statement by the National Association of Biology Teachers was, as you know, I think, revised precisely because they realized that it was making a metaphysical statement that went beyond the bounds of what science would allow one to say. On the basis of science alone, you could not say that it was unsupervised and impersonal. So you're very right to draw our attention to the fact that we're comparing here two philosophies, naturalism and theism. That's where the debate lies.
Yeah, perhaps if somebody else doesn't ask it, I'd like to of Dr. Hardin as well. Is there any evidence for naturalism? Not
Any
for
evidence
science,
for naturalism?
Is there any? Would you give evidences for naturalism, that naturalism is true?
I'm sorry, I'm dealing in a world in which that's the only way we attack any problems. It doesn't mean there aren't other things. I just don't find them of any interest.
Thank you.
Okay, a question for Professor Hardin.
Professor Hardin, what did you base your belief that there was no God on?
I'm sorry, what was that?
What did you base your belief that there is no God?
Oh,
What did you base that on?
I'm sorry. I'll have to really quick go over this. I think I'll enlarge some on what Dr. Craig said in a particular way. Suppose somebody said, there is a human being in this room. Now, I think that would correspond to the theistic position. I think there is at least one human being in this room. So we don't argue about that. All right. Now, a person says, there is an elephant in this room. I think, after looking around thoroughly, I think you'd be willing to take an atheistic position. See, I'm stretching the word atheistic. You'd say elephantistic. I've looked every place and I haven't seen an elephant. I'm willing to go the extreme position, say there is no elephant in this room. But if you say there is a flea in this room, F-L-E-A, I will not say there is not a flea in this room. There may well be one, and I find it difficult to imagine the circumstance under which I would say bet $1,000 there's not a single flea in this room. You see, so in that case, I would take the position which was first labeled in 1869 by Thomas Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog. At a party, he had to invent real quick, and he invented a word. He said, I'm an agnostic. I don't say there is a God. I don't say there isn't a God. I say I don't know. And this science has some questions on which it takes an agnostic position, maybe for decades at a time. Then sometimes one of those is resolved, and it flops one way or the other. So there are these three possibilities. And as far as God itself is concerned, this is a question of taste. Whether you say, I am an atheist or an agnostic. I prefer to say I'm an agnostic, just as I am not willing to say there's not a flea in this room.
Yes, sir.
I would like to take a slightly different approach. I believe that religion is very little to do with God. It is merely man's search for meaning in this life and his pursuit of God. But in reality, God pursues us. I was delighted tonight to hear both speakers, especially Professor Hardin, get very personal. And it's very easy to understand what happens when a theory is wrong. It is just replaced by another theory. But both speakers tonight were very personal. And what I would like the speakers to do, starting with Professor Hardin, I'd like you to explain to Professor Craig the consequences in life and death if he is wrong. And then I would like Professor Craig to explain to Professor Hardin the consequences in life and death if he is wrong.
Well, that's a nice big question.
Thank goodness I defined agnostic already.
Well, let me just say this. I think that what the questioner has hit upon in a colloquial way is a famous wager argument of Blaise Pascal, the great French physicist and mathematician. Pascal's wager basically said that if you, he says in life, we all have to gamble on God or not. We can't choose not to play. He says the game is in progress. How will you bet? And Pascal said that, and he was the inventor of probability theory, so he knew what he was talking about. Pascal said that if God exists and you bet that he does not, then you suffer infinite loss. If you bet that God does exist and he in fact does, then you have infinite gain. And therefore, he argued that it's the more prudent of the two courses to bet that God exists, because the infinite gain just swamps the infinite loss that you would experience otherwise. And it seems to me that in a case where the evidence is equally balanced, that these kind of prudential arguments are quite correct, that when the evidence is equal, that one ought to go on the basis of these sorts of prudential sorts of considerations. And so I would think that Pascal's argument is correct there, and that one should wager on God if the evidence is equal. But of course, I don't think the evidence is equal. I think there are good grounds for believing that God exists, and that therefore the side of the scale containing the weight of the evidence in favor of God, I think, outweighs the side of the scale having whatever evidence there might be thought to be for naturalism.
I have a very brief thing that I want to say. I was thinking, looking at this as the man from Mars, and looking at the man from Mars saying, well, now, what position does this put God in? I've been informed that God is omniscient, that he knows everything. At this point, God knows what Pascal is doing and why he's doing it. And he says, oh, that sneaky mathematician. He thinks he'll get into heaven with that trick. He won't. To hell with him.
All right, yes, ma'am.
Professor Hardin, I'd like to know where you think that you're going to go when you die.
Well, I like, there's one of Mark Twain's essays, maybe there's more than one, which he faces up to, which was a very living possibility in his day, in the 1880s, 1890, and so on, that people, Christians thought they would, when they died, then they'd go into heaven, they'd have wings, they'd flap, and they'd sing all day long. He says, well, it'd sure be exciting to fly with your own wings, but by about the second day, you'd get sick and tired of those songs, and the third day, and the fourth day, and the fifth day, and he came to the conclusion that he would rather go to hell. It's probably a lot more interesting.
So I'm still not clear where you think that you're going to be going.
Look, I think it's all a figment of the imagination, and we think human beings are special. I don't know. I've had some dogs that I were very fond of, and if I've ever seen soulful eyes, there's soulful eyes in the dog. And the thought of my going to heaven and not having a dog with me, I don't like that at all. I think that's segregation. That's no good.
Yes, sir.
Was it your second pillar that dealt with the statistics of the beginning of the universe? I'm trying to remember the exact word, but did you say that it was inconceivable that such a thing could happen?
I said that the odds against the universe being life permitting were so small as to be incomprehensible and incalculable.
Okay, well, having read Hardin's book about the filters, I recognize that as language that is intended to prevent thought. And using his numerate filter, I would say that it's not quite right to do a statistical analysis of this because we only have one sample. We don't have a random data set. The only universe we have is one in which life has propagated, and so it's not quite fair to compare that to the statistics of life not being able to exist in the universe, or a universe not being able to exist, because there are no humans around in such an instance to declare that life hasn't existed.
Yes, this is an objection that one sometimes sees in the literature, but I think for those who understand the fine-tuning argument, it's not difficult to explain the sense of probability and the sample set that one is talking about. In his book, The World Within the World, the Oxford physicist John Barrow gives the following illustration that I find very helpful. He said, make a dot on a piece of paper and let that be the universe. Make it a red dot, and that is our universe. Now, he says, alter slightly some of these constants, like the proton-neutron mass ratio, or the strength of the weak force, or the expansion of the universe, and let that be a new universe. And if it's life permitting, make it a red dot. If it's life prohibiting, make it a blue dot. And then alter them again and make another dot, and then alter it again and another dot. And you just keep doing this, altering these constants slightly, and until your paper is filled with universes or filled with dots. And what you discover is that you have a sea of blue with just a few pinpoints of red here or there. And that's the sense in which one means that it is enormously and incomprehensibly improbable that the universe should be life permitting. Your sample set of universes is all of these other possible universes that result just by altering these parameters in these very, very small ways.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hardin, would you agree with me if I made the statement that in today's world, the scope of mankind's knowledge is growing exponentially?
I'm afraid I would. And along with that, the problem of information overload becomes ever more important. There's an awful lot of knowledge, and it takes a long time sometimes to realize it's out there, and I'm worried about that. And finally, we may get to the point where we're so overloaded, even with all the computerized aids that we use. Those don't really change the problem significantly. You know, a person has a computer, and he plugs into one of these indexes, really, and he gets back 150,000 entries. Well, who's going to read 150,000 entries before lunch? Mm-hmm. You know, you find says, oh, to hell with it, and out they go. You see, this is information overload, and I think it's a serious problem.
Isn't it also true then that for every discovery or observation that proves a new theory, that it tends to open Pandora's box from the standpoint of now we have a new plethora of questions?
Well, I would say that this is where the ecolate way of thinking comes in, that the reason ecology is so hated by people, and environmentalism, which is based on ecology, is because it shows the significance of unforeseen consequences. People design, say the World Bank is approached to build a dam someplace that's going to cost $3 billion, and they love to spend money, so they send $3 billion there to build the dam, and then they get through and they discover that if you add it all up, they've probably done more harm than good. This is the case with dam after dam. As I understand, the World Bank is not taking on any new dams from now on. They've become so disgusted with what they do. See, the Chinese are now building the world's biggest dam. They're going to displace 1 million people, displace them from where the dam has to be, from some of the richest land in China. And of course, they'll give each one some money and say, go buy another farm. Another farm in China? Where? You see, this is a case of, this is what ecology does. It says you've got to look for the unforeseen consequences and foresee them in advance and make your decision on the total picture. And since the picture is never completely total, that means that you're never completely satisfied with what you do.
Okay, we're getting past our time, and I think that's okay. I want to remind you that there will be a coffee house in the Multicultural Center at the USEN after this. So if there's not time, if you're in line and there's not time for you to ask your question, you will have an opportunity to do that at that time and in that place. But I will let this go on for a few more minutes. I don't see any point in rushing through. So there's a question there, sir? Well, I think it's time to turn to another question.
Well, I just had one final thing, and that was, you know, I'm not a scientist, but as the more I've learned about science and the sciences of all types in my life, the more daunting it is to realize that no matter how much we learn, the folly of mankind will never be any closer to complete knowledge. If anything, complete knowledge gets further and further away. And this is just a humbling thought.
Okay, yes, sir.
It seems to me that traditionally God is just simply a way of explaining the unexplainable, whether it be the ancient Egyptians using God to explain a drought, or it's the ancient Greeks using God to explain the sun rising and setting, or the 20th century using God to explain the Big Bang or to explain the creation of the universe. And I mean, ultimately, God is just a way of answering questions that we don't have the knowledge yet to answer. So isn't it slightly arrogant of us as humans in this day and age to assume that this time we've got it right? That this time we know that God is the answer.
Yeah.
Whereas, as shown many times before, it's failed.
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, this raises the old so-called God of the gaps issue. You know, are we just punting to God to kind of plug up the gaps in our scientific knowledge? And certainly one would be very skeptical if that's the route I were trying to take, and I would share with you a real concern about that. But I want to emphasize that in the arguments that I've given, I gave two scientific arguments, the first and the second. Now, of course, the ethical argument wouldn't be affected by what you're saying, but the first two were scientific, and they were based not upon gaps in our scientific knowledge, but rather on what the best of scientific knowledge does tell us, so that it wasn't an appeal to God to plug a gap or to fill in ignorance, but rather it's saying that the best scientific evidence we have indicates that space and time are finite in the past, that the universe did begin to exist, that it did have this incredible complex fine-tuning of the initial conditions there, and that these are signposts that point beyond it to some greater reality as its explanation. And it just, I think, whether these arguments are worthy or not depends upon how convincing the evidence is that, in fact, the universe had a beginning and that it does have these complex initial conditions. And I think the evidence is quite good that it does. Let me try to get at this another way, too, though, that I think can be helpful, and that is these arguments can also be put in deductive forms so that they're not really appealing to God as an explanatory entity, but rather they're simply deductive arguments. For example, the first argument can be stated in the following way. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Therefore, 3, the universe has a cause. And then you unpack what it is to be a cause of the universe in terms of timelessness, spacelessness, immateriality, and so forth. Now, in a deductive argument like that, if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows logically and inescapably, whether you like it or not. And it seems to me that with regard to those two premises, they are both more plausibly true than their negations. Particularly that second premise, the universe began to exist. That's not a religious statement. That's a statement you can find in any textbook on astrophysics or cosmology. And it certainly seems to be more probably true than its negation. So when you put it in the form of a deductive argument like that, I think that it's a good argument for that conclusion. And the second argument can also be put in a deductive form. It would be premise 1, the initial conditions of the universe are due either to law, chance, or intelligence. Premise 2, the initial conditions are not due to chance or law. Therefore, number 3, they are due to intelligence. And again, it all depends on whether or not those premises are true, and I think that they are certainly more plausibly true than their negations, and therefore the conclusion would follow deductively and logically.
Well, isn't it true, though, that just because the law hasn't been discovered yet doesn't mean that the law doesn't necessarily exist?
Of course that's true. That's absolutely right. But then it's a matter of plausibility or probability. Are these truly initial conditions, or are these somehow intricately related in some way that we don't know? And the best scientific evidence is that these are not related, that these are truly contingent features, that there isn't any inherent connection, say, between the ratio of matter over antimatter and the expansion speed of the universe, or the entropy of the universe put in at the initial conditions. These initial conditions are not the result of some higher logical law, but seem to be genuinely contingent, non-law-like quantities that are just put in at the beginning as initial conditions.
Okay, I think we probably have time for only a couple of more formal questions here. So, ma'am, please go ahead.
I first of all would like to thank UCSB for holding the Veritas Forum. I have a short comment and a question. First off, in Professor Hardin's use of John 1:1, which is written not to the Hebrews but to non-Jewish Christians, about how the word was, first there was the word. The Greek word found in the Septuagint is logos, which translates to mean divine mind, not actual words. So I really didn't understand where you're going with that knowledge. I didn't get that.
Thank you.
I don't know if you had more to say about that, or...
No, this is all new to me.
Okay. And then secondly, you say you're agnostic, and it's kind of funny that Gnosticism means knowledge, and you say you don't know, so I think it's kind of funny. But but then you say you're an agnostic, but then in your story you said there's no God. So how can you say there's no God when you claim you don't know? And after you said that there's no God, you had this huge spiritual, uplifting peace of mind and peace of heart and peace of all your questions when you don't know.
Oh, well, you see, but I was 14 then. I hadn't heard of T.H. Huxley yet. You see, Huxley introduced the term agnostic. I didn't know about it. I did the best I could, and I said there is no God, but this was, if I'd been challenged and had been reminded of Huxley's work, I would have said, well, I'm an agnostic.
But then you said that that moment made you a true unbeliever. Are you still a true unbeliever?
I suppose not. I was just trying to be witty and failing. See, there is a book called The True Believer, which I heartily recommend to you. A man who educated himself in philosophy. It's a perfectly amazing thing. A worker, a field worker. It's quite a remarkable book. And I was playing on that. You see, he was a true believer. I mean, he was talking about true believers. He wasn't a true believer. And I said, well, I'm sort of a true unbeliever. But forget about it.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank both the speakers for coming tonight and sharing their views with us. I find it quite informative. And I think what this forum, what is raised to me is not exactly which one is better to seek the truth, but why are we seeking that truth? In regards to the universe and it's being infinitely almost impossible for it to sustain life. The question is, I think, why do we need to be here? How special do we have to be? How fragile is the human ego that it needs a reason to be here instead of just being here? Why is it that we need to create something higher than us that needed to create us? And I think that's something, is religion more of an aspect to verify that we're special and that we're here for a reason? Or is it something different?
Well, I guess I think that the existential issue that's here is that human beings, I think, have always sought for the questions of the meaning of their lives. I mean, this was what faced me as a teenager when I thought about my death, that someday I was going to die. I asked, what then is the meaning of life if it all ends in death, whether I live a good life or a bad life, whether I live as someone who just lives for self and pleasure or someone who lives for the good of others. What difference does it make if I end up the same? What is the meaning of my life in light of my death? So I think these are profound existential questions that we need to ask. And if we're not to just delude ourselves, we need to ask ourselves, is there evidence of some transcendent purpose or meaning or reason for our existence? Because I very, very vehemently reject the idea that we need to invent God in order to give meaning to life. That I would regard as detestable. You can't invent the truth because you want something to be that way. You have to ask yourself, is it really that way? And so I think out of this profound existential human predicament, we look at the universe and ask ourselves, is the natural world all there is? Or is there some greater reason and transcendent ground for it. And as I said, for the reasons I gave, I'm persuaded that there really is, and that this isn't just the product of human invention.
Thank you.
Let me make some concluding remarks. First of all, to remind you to please fill out your response cards and put them in the box in the back, or you can mail them in later. A box for donations in the back, and order forms for tapes and videos also in the back. I am sorry for those people who have been standing in line waiting, but it is time for the coffee house, and I suggest that you be the first people to address the speakers that you want to when we get to the coffee house in a few moments. Thanks to both of our speakers.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.